Hello, everyone, and welcome to Game Industry Legends. My name is Chris Melissinos, and I'm the Principal Evangelist for Video Games at AWS. And on our first episode for 2024, I sit down with Game Industry legend Alexander Seropian, founder of Bungie, Wide Load Games, Industrial Toys, his new company, Look North World, and is the co-host of the Fourth Curtain podcast series. On today's program, Alex and I dive into the origins of Bungie, the creation of smash hits like Marathon and Halo. We'll discuss the choices that found him in leading the company through several pivots, his deciding to leave Bungie for other pursuits, and what he's working on next. It is my pleasure to welcome Alex Seropian to the Game Industry Legends program. Alex.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, man. Thank you.
What's happening?
We're going to have an awesome conversation today. Happy 2024. I'm thrilled that we have you on here as our first guest on the Game Industry Legends program for this year. So welcome, and thanks for taking time with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. I guess good start, and you can only, it's only going to get better, just by default. So
awesome. All right. So, Alex, what I love to do when we start these interviews, I've got these 5 questions that I ask everybody that I interview here. So let's go rip through them real quickly. We're going to talk first about your earliest days with computers and video games. So what was the first computer or video game system that you really remember having at the home? What's the one that stuck with you?
At home was
Yes.
Atari 2600.
Atari.
Actually, it was the Sears Telegames, which was the rebrand version that Atari did the deal with Sears, and my dad, want to save a couple bucks.
Went and picked up some screwdrivers, some Craftsman screwdrivers, some motor oil, and an Atari.
Exactly. I remember when he brought it home, like it was not a thing that I asked for, it was a thing that he brought home, and it changed my life for sure. I played a lot of Atari with my brother after school with friends, obviously pre-internet. And I very clearly remember playing the Indiana Jones game on there, not being able to solve it. And my buddy was also playing it, and you couldn't Google
how to do that,
solve it out together, trading tips back and forth. But that was the first console.
Yeah, and that was also the game where you're like, wait, I need 2 joysticks plugged in here to play this damn thing. And your parachute kept getting stuck on that damn branch, and you had to parachute off the cliff. But that's for a whole other set of discussions. All right, so Atari 2600, the Sears Tele Arcade with the light.
Telegames.
Yeah, that was the
Telegames,
Telegames, right, with the brushed aluminum. And a facade to it. So awesome. All right. What was the first arcade game you remember playing?
Oh, okay. Well, so where I grew up in the middle of town was a toy store called Big Top. Toys, knickknacks, like plushies, stuff like that. And they always had 1 or 2 arcade games that would rotate in and out. Defender was definitely one of the first ones that I ever played. Tempest was in there. Scramble, which was sort of like, I guess probably came out after Defender, a little bit fancier looking. And then I used to go over to Yonkers, New York, to go to Nathan's, where they had a huge arcade room.
Yes.
And they had like a 4-player networked sit-down pole position. And that was so far ahead of its time, racing against other, in the sit-down arcade. Blew my mind.
Yeah. And I grew up in Queens, New York, so I'm very familiar with Nathan's. I'm very familiar with Boardwalk walk arcades and stuff like that. Awesome. All right, so programming. When did you first start programming, and in what language?
Well, basic. And, I guess when I was in 6th grade, like our middle school, like set up a computer room, and it must have had like 10 Commodore PETs in there. So these were kind of all-in-one PCs. I guess you call it a PC. They had a disk cassette tape,
Hmm.
drive. And I remember there were post-it notes on the side of them, or little notes that said how much RAM they had, and I think they were all 8K,
Oh,
except one was 16K. And it's like, what were we gonna do with the 16K? Nothing, but we would just run to get that machine
yeah,
because it was at 16K,
because that was the big one.
Yeah, and on those computers, you could, there were a few games you could play, and you could see the source code. You could just open up the file and look at the code, and that was kind of like how I discovered like where software came from. It's
Yeah,
like oh, there's these instructions, and then you write print Alex rules, 10, print Alex rules 20, go to 10. It's like, yeah,
that's right.
and then somebody showed you put a semicolon
Yes,
after it, and it'll fill it horizontally,
I was just
and
about to say that.
yes, yeah.
Yeah,
And that just started for me, my love of programming was all about just problem solving discovery. It's like, oh, I can make the computer do stuff. Like,
yeah,
what else is there to do? And then,
empowerment, right?
kind of went from there. Yeah,
Control.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so many of us and so many people, right, that from that era, that's how we learned how to program, and it wasn't this structured way of doing it. Discover those programs, you open up and go, wait, this thing says lives and it has the number 3 in it. If I change it to 5, what happens? Oh, I have 5 lives now, right? And it's like, what else can I do to this damn thing? So yes, that's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, from the earliest games that you played, which one do you think had the biggest impact on you? One that you still maybe revisit to this day, or one that just stuck with you? Maybe in lieu of what is your favorite game of all time? What's the one that stuck with you?
Ooh, from those early days.
Hmm.
Well, a lot of the Atari 2600 games were very similar, even though you would look at the packaging and they promised worlds that were amazingly different. The original tank combat games on the Atari
Yeah.
were, my brother and I played all of those. And the very first game that I made professionally, I guess you could say professionally, was basically a ripoff of Atari Combat.
Come back.
And then I guess Tetris. I don't think I discovered Tetris until I was in high school or college, but I have always played Tetris.
Yeah,
Like
same.
I don't think there's been a year of my life when I haven't fired up Tetris.
I think it is the game that I've purchased more versions of on more platforms than ever
Yeah.
before, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
because it is an
Yeah.
evergreen game. Okay, all
Yeah.
right. And then the fifth question. Who would you say is probably the most influential programmer or designer, industry figure that really impacted you? Like I know it's hard to pick one, but who is, or
Oh,
let's
I
just
mean,
say,
my
name
my
one.
yeah, I did my first partner at Bungie, Jason. I learned so much from. He was way more advanced programmer than I, or at least he just had a lot more experience. And that I'm very much a builder, and I learn a lot from uh, seeing other people's work, or like looking at what other people do. I just learned a tremendous amount code wise from him. And then after Bungie, I still code, but
Mhm.
not nearly as much. So
Well, I love that
I would,
the person
yeah,
that's had the most impact on you is your business partner. We're going to talk about Jason. We're going to talk about when you met and how you got into that. But first, thank you for answering those 5. I
sure.
appreciate it, and I know our viewers do too. All right, so let's go all the way back to the beginning. So you attended the University of Chicago as a CS student, and upon graduating, you were kind of at these crossroads of like what you wanted to do. Why did you decide to start a video game company?
Good question. I really wanted to start like my dream when I was a kid was that I would be a businessman, like I don't know what that meant, but like my role models growing up were, my parents and
Mhm.
my grandfather. My grandfather, both my maternal grandparents, grandfathers, I guess. They both were refugees. They left their homes, started a new life, during like the World War I, World War II, and started over and started businesses, and they were very successful. And my dad was a professional, but he was a doctor, but he had he had his own practice. He's very entrepreneurial. And my mother was an artist. So those were my role models growing up. And I always loved the idea of being in control of my own destiny, my own fate, like not having to answer. I was never good at answering to people.
Right.
So, when I was getting out of college and I had spent, technically I was a math major because there was no CS degree at the time.
Right.
But when I was interviewing for jobs, they were programming jobs, and they were programming jobs in sort of like the consulting or the finance sector. So it would have been a fantastic start to a career, but it felt to me like if I did that, I would probably be, I'd be working for somebody, and my future would be different than if I tried to build something myself. So I could never have articulated that at the time, but in hindsight, I think that's why my gut said, go out on your own, even though, when I asked my dad his advice, he said he told me to go get some experience before trying to do that. But I think that maybe that was reverse psychology. Who knows? But the end result of that conversation was, all right, I'm going to do it. Let's go.
I love the fact that, you mentioned your father was a doctor, your mother was an artist, and that kind of tracks with other of our contemporaries, right, within the games industry. I look at, designers like Richard Garriott, right? His father worked for NASA, his mother was an artist, right? That just lent right in there. It's this incredible melding of art and story and technology that is what video games are, right? And so no surprise that the influence from your parents helped to kind of shape that for you. Yeah. So I love that. I love that. Okay, so let's talk about your first game. So your first game your first commercial game that was also, I believe you open sourced the code for it, was GNOP, which was Pong spelled backwards, right?
So clever. So clever.
So good. So you've, it's not like we haven't seen characters that just have names spelled backwards and palettes swapped to become the, another enemy in other games. But so you built this before launching Bungie. So tell us quickly, why start there? What was it with GNOP?
Honestly, just teaching myself how to take a program and turn it into something finished.
Right.
That could, and this must have been in the late 80s, early 90s, I guess. So, there was no internet. I don't even know how it got, what I did with it. And it must have gone shareware or
BBS and stuff like that. Yeah.
But really just, I was in school, just not taking myself too seriously, just trying to learn and put something together.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, a few people actually sent me money for source code.
Yeah, I think I'd read somewhere it was like $15 for the source code. Yeah. And there you go. But then that's the first taste of, wait a minute, the thing that I love that I'm doing can actually generate money for me so I can continue doing these things, right?
Yeah.
And so you founded Bungie Software Products Corporation in 1991, right? And your first game, and you alluded to this, was Operation Desert Storm, this black and white top-down strategy tank game that was inspired by what was going on with the Gulf War, that was going on in the world at the time. And you're making disc copies and assembling those boxes, I think, in your parents' home. Like, what were you feeling at the time? Like, all right, you did this Pong game, and now you've built this thing whole cloth from your ideas and your capabilities, and now you're assembling a product yourself. Like, was it just complete elation? Was it you know, it didn't deter you, obviously, from continuing in this field. Like, what were you feeling and how were you selling the game at that time?
Yeah, well, so that was definitely 1991, I'm pretty sure. And I was starting a business. That's what I was doing. I'd made that game. I'd gotten some help from some friends. My brother helped me with some stuff, and but it was a very small indie effort. But I wanted to start a company, and I was full of hustle. I I found that I made this VHS tape, which was like pitch, for the company, which I had sent to friends and family to raise enough money to print boxes. So I was doing stuff like that. I was getting the printer to print the boxes. Like you said, we were manufacturing in the basement. I had a shrink wrap machine. I had watched a company called Inline Design, which was this run by Daryl Peck. They were, I think, one of the only successful Mac video game companies. They had, I'm trying to remember the games they had. I remember a game called 3 and 3. But he had a publishing business, like whole product line. That to me, that was permission, basically, that, oh, this is a thing that can be done, so why don't I try it? And that first game basically broke even.
Yeah, 2,500 copies or so, right? That you had sold of the game.
You're a good researcher.
It
basically broke even. And that was right when I met Jason. Jason was taking a class that I was in. And my introduction to Jason was the AI professor was describing a piece of software that we could use for class, and he's like, "Oh, you'll have to go to the lab because you need a machine with 8 megabytes of RAM, which is an absurd amount of memory for a computer to have back then." And I just remember this guy in the corner of the room going, "Oh, my computer's got 8 megs of RAM, no problem." I was like, look at this guy.
Enough memory for 3 AIs or whatever we wanted to call them.
Yeah, whatever. And then so that's how we met, and he was working on a game too, so the first game was, I want to start this company, and so I am gonna hustle and work and do everything to make it happen. And that decision to do that was after the game was done. So I had made the game with the hope that if I can make something that works and is fun, then I'll start this company. That was sort of the challenge to myself, I guess.
Well, I mean, I guess your first hustle was convincing Jason to actually finish the game, right? Because at first he was looking at this and you were like, no, and you just kept at him that this is something we can turn into this product, right? Turn into this game that we can then publish.
Well, I guess the first hustle was getting Desert Storm out and getting some distribution. And then, Jason didn't really want to, he had this game called Minotaur, which is still one of my favorite games. And he was like, it's okay. I don't know if I'm going to do anything with it. And we would play it, and this is so much fun. Let's finish it. And awesome. Yeah, he did require a little bit of convincing. But the fact that, it already like put a game in a box and had shipped some copies was maybe enough to convince him to give it a go. And we had a similar experience with that game, which was, it kind of broke even.
Minotaur Labyrinths of Crete, right?
Yes.
But again, so I think this is foundational to the story in your career, and we're going to dig into that later about understanding the processes that are required across every facet of the creative process, the development, getting it out there, doing the marketing behind it. And that has shaped your desire to figure out how to streamline those things to be most effective. And that's kind of been something throughout your career. We're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. So, so you said it well received, right? It broke even. Did it feel different than other similar games at the time, like Ultima and those sorts of games? How was it different?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was multiplayer only. There was no single player, which was a
Hmm.
kind of little unheard of back in the early 90s. This must have been like 92, I think, 92,
Yeah.
93. And you needed a modem, you know, or an internet like a Wi-Fi on a network, not a Wi-Fi. They didn't have
Yeah. Apple
Wi-Fi.
Talk, right?
Ethernet, yeah,
Yeah.
Apple Talk or
Yeah.
Ethernet, yeah. That's what we were calling it back in the day. So
That's
we
right.
would go over to like one of the university buildings where they had a little network of computers and play, but not super mainstream accessible that way.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, and we should also mention too that Bungie was focused exclusively on Mac development in this era, right? That
Yeah.
was what
It's
you
what
grew.
we had.
Yeah.
That's what we had. It was a masterstroke of genius to focus on a platform that was underserved where we would have a competitive advantage. But the truth is, it's the computers that we had.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and right, you kind of make do with what you have. I always say, when people ask my first computer, I grew up programming, my first computer was a Commodore VIC-20, not the Commodore 64. I'm like, no, those were for the rich kids. We had 3,293 bytes of of space, right, to type in basic programs. And so, but that's what you had, and you worked with what you had, right? Okay.
Right.
So you've got two games under your belt, right? These commercial ones. And now you jump into that third. And this is the game that really starts to get people noticing Bungie, right? So that game was Pathways into Darkness. The game released in 1993, was, I believe, partially inspired by the work that was going on by your other contemporaries, right? The two Johns down at id Software and Wolfenstein 3D. And Jason had built this, your business partner, had built a 3D engine for the Mac. And again, this really helped to put Bungie on the map. And it seemed you really had most of that field for yourself. So tell us about the release of Pathways. Like, how did it change the way you and Jason were able to operate and grow the company?
Yeah. So I mean, you're right. That was the first game that made money. And you see a pattern like that, I think, in fairly universally. It's like when you're trying to do something for the first time, it's, I guess you could say, it doesn't necessarily come quick on the first try, but maybe a better way to say it is you get to great through iteration. So yeah, Pathways was the third game. It started by taking those brick walls that were in Minotaur, if you've ever seen Minotaur,
Mm-hmm.
and projecting them onto walls, like kind of like how Wolfenstein worked. But starting to lean into what Bungie games would become known for, which is a kind of a rich world with some storytelling. And so Pathways was more of an adventure game than a shooter, really. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it did have shooting, but it was a little bit more of a slower paced kind of adventure game. And uh, that was the first game where we got distribution into stores, wasn't just mail order.
Mm-hmm.
And I clearly remember the moment when basically we had the game had come out, and it was sort of tracking similarly to how the first two games started. And I started asking myself, how many times are we going to try this?
Yeah.
Is this working? I don't know. And I very distinctly remember getting our first real distributor order
Mm-hmm.
coming on. It came over the fax machine, and I'm watching this fax come, and I see it's coming from, I think they were called Try and Bite, maybe. They had a clever name like that.
Yeah, that sounds
Um,
familiar.
and I see it says purchase order, and it's scrolling up, and I see I see the dollars. It was like a $50,000 order or something like
Yeah.
that. And my eyes like bugged out of my head. And I was like, I jumped off the Stairmaster that I was on next to in my office next, it was all one room. We were living in a basement. And, I high-fived myself, probably called Jason, I don't know. And that was when the company became, you know, more than kind of us two plus, help from friends. That we started
Yeah.
hiring some folks
I mean, it must have been an
and got
extraordinary
got an
valid.
office.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been extraordinary validation of your assumptions, of your skills. I mean, this is now the third time. Okay, fine. The first two weren't. They allowed you to continue doing this, right? It didn't cost you any money. You broke even on them. Now you're kind of like, are we going to just sustain and survive, or are we going to be able to grow? This is just a clear validation again of your of the way you approach things, about opportunity that you saw, about method of distribution, about the type of content that's going to resonate. That must have been incredibly validating, not just from a revenue perspective, but just as a creative, right, who wants to bring these types of things forward.
Well, it felt like, I mean, obviously I can't remember shit because I'm so old, and I very clearly remember that, everything about it. So it was, well, I would say more than validating. It was, again, it was kind of permission, that I could focus on building something, myself, and not relying on somebody else to build for me, or to get, whatever from. So, and it was not, I guess maybe it's easier when you're younger and the opportunity cost is low, because it didn't come quick. That was it was a couple years in, and it was a couple years of unknown and doubt. So but that was very important.
Yeah, when we're all young in our careers too, you have infinite amount of time ahead of you, right? So you weather some of those things, and that's how it feels, right?
Yeah, but I mean, there is a lesson in there that it's reasonable to expect things to take time, and trying, failing, trying, failing.
Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan of the VC phrase "fail fast," but I'm a fan of the sentiment. I prefer, to succeed quick.
Succeed quick, and don't be so in love with your own ideas that you're not willing to get rid of them.
The sentiment of the quicker you can get iteration is the faster you can learn, and that iteration is key to unlocking success. And that pattern has repeated itself over and over.
Oh yeah,
Me.
Well, I mean, so unbeknownst to you, right? This set the stage for the next game that you created that really just set you on this explosive trajectory, right? And that was Marathon. And in getting ready for this episode and hearing from colleagues that listened, said, "Oh, Marathon, yes." It wasn't Halo first for some people, it was Marathon first. So let's talk about Marathon. First-person shooter game, again, designed for the Mac, and this allowed Mac enthusiasts and that kind of market segment to be able to play the games they were watching their PC counterparts play that just really wasn't in abundance, right? If at all, on the Mac at that time. So the first thing I want to ask, though, with Marathon, was this a tech endeavor first, or was it a story-driven endeavor? So tell us about how you came up with you and Jason came up with the concept for Marathon, and what was really the genesis of that.
Well, Jason was working on the next version of the engine, and he's a very prolific writer. So I think a lot of that happened kind of concurrently. I'm trying to remember the very first demo we played. My first memories from playing an early build of Marathon was like an arena style map. But like back then, like we had no blueprint for making anything. It's like we had hired our first employees. So Doug, who I still work with today, was our first employee, and we had Matt Sell, who's now a writer at Certain Affinity. We had hired an art director. We had a couple of friends who were doing art, Greg Kirkpatrick, who was working on story with Jason and levels. This was all like we were learning how to like hire people. We were learning how to build a company. We were taking the engine to the next version and creating the story. And I think that relationship that Jason and Greg had, where they kind of challenged each other to one up and be creative on the story, led to the terminals and the text story that was told through that. So, I don't know exactly how to characterize which kind of came
First, yeah, what
first
the
because
order was.
everything was kind of standing up concurrently. I would say that it was almost always the case. Halo was this way too, where the most formative early experiences during development were the multiplayer experiences,
Mm.
what we would stand up first. And it's again, it was kind of like where you would get accelerated iteration and learning because when you have, a group of people playing, it forces a group of people to talk about what they didn't like or what they did like, and that pushes the fundamentals, the fundamental mechanics forward super quick.
Yeah.
Which is, I, in hindsight, is just such a smart way to develop the foundation of the gameplay before you start building all that single use content that
Yeah.
you don't really want to be redoing if you have to change, how the play works.
Right. I mean, look, so, I mean, when Marathon hit, right, it was considered, and it was, more polished and a more sophisticated kind of experience than Doom was. It was employing things like free look even before Quake, right? Right. So you were changing the way and creating more advanced space that players were able to kind of engage with. And it was, again, all on the Mac, right? So now, Mac users had a game that really rivaled anything their PC counterparts had. As you said, multiplayer for 8 people, Doom was 4, right? So at that time, did you realize that you were kind of innovating in some ways beyond your contemporaries? Had you spoken to the two Johns at id? Like, what was that like?
Our paths would cross here and there. I remember, I do remember getting invited to a meeting at Apple's campus, where Steve Jobs was looking for input on how to make the Mac better for games, and John Carmack was there, and I was there, but we weren't.
Your industry
we
colleagues.
we weren't. So yeah, we
Right.
were. Yeah, we weren't super pals, and we weren't on the phone chatting about,
Right.
hey, what are you doing here? What are you doing? In hindsight, that would have been great, but we weren't. And we did take a lot of inspiration, and in some ways, I think we felt like the Mac was an underdog. I think we felt like we were an underdog, and
Yeah.
and needed to do something different. I don't think we were necessarily, oh, we have to be better.
Right.
A little bit, maybe that was motivation, but I
Sure.
think more so than that, wanted to be different, have our own lane, have our own thing that we could be, known for.
Yeah.
And the campaign and the story really, I think, became that for us. And that was somewhat intentional. And certainly as the games went on,
Yeah.
Marathon 2 and Infinity, were that way.
Yeah, look, I mean, I remember I never had a Mac at home. It was too expensive, but I did have a friend who had one. I remember playing it and was blown away by it. And what it also kind of reminded me of was Dark Forces, that same type of engine and level structure, right? Which was released only 3 months, after a Marathon made it out there. And so,
Really?
all right.
Dark Forces came out that long ago? I
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
All
Dark
right.
Forces
Because,
came out.
we were working on Marathon for a decent amount of time.
Mhm.
We had started showing it at Macworld, and we had no idea what we were doing, but people really loved it, when they would
Yeah.
play it at the show. And so they would ask if they could order a copy, even though it wasn't out yet. And we would take orders, and then they would ask us when they were going to get the game, and we would, I don't know why we would say, "Oh, very soon,
When it's
2
ready.
weeks." Yeah. Well, no, we should have
Right.
said when it was ready, but we would say something dumb like, like, hey, when do we think we'll be done? Oh, we're going to be done in a few weeks.
Yeah.
Okay, it'll be out in a few weeks. And of course, game development, that's never happens.
There is no straight line. There is no straight
Yeah.
line. But I mean, it was this huge success for you guys. It goes on to sell more than 100,000 copies right before you go on to release your next version, or the sequel to that, Marathon 2, and then Marathon Infinity to follow that. But Marathon 2 also marked a bit of a turning point or a pivot for the company. It was the first game that you then ported over to the Windows 95 platform, right? Which caused a little bit of a rift, in the Mac versus PC community. It's like, we're never going to stop, platform wars, right? That's just, I think it's just part of our industry, right? But what was the big reason for embracing the Windows platform now? As you said, you had kind of this wide berth within that space and kind of limited competition there. Now you're moving into this much broader space. Like, what was the impetus for moving to also support the Windows platform?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at that, I distinctly remember we would talk about that a lot because from my perspective, there was a very large and very engaged community of people playing games on the PC, and we were ignoring it. Whether we were like trying to be strategically focused on the Mac, we weren't. We were just young and small. So thinking about honestly what was best for our community, what was best for our business, why would we not want to make games for what was probably an order of magnitude larger community of gamers? That was the conversation we were having. Like why are we limiting ourselves? And we didn't have an answer for why we were limiting ourselves, other than we had made many decisions about how the game was built and constructed that might make it difficult. So when we started having those conversations about the first Marathon, instead of trying to port the first Marathon, we basically decided that we would improve the engine to be not device dependent,
right,
for the second one. And I do remember when we had one of the engineers on the team, Ryan Martel, who helped do that work. I remember our office was in this like old school building, in the south side of Chicago. So there's big open spaces. That's kind of how we kind of grew up, in these open rooms, very collaborative. But he kind of did all this work surreptitiously, so that one day he was like, hey, you want to check out the build of the next game? And we all go over to his Mac to play, and he had hooked up the monitor to a PC. We thought we were playing on the Mac, and then he's like, look over here, check it out, you're actually playing on a PC. And we're like, what? Or blew our minds.
How dare you? Right. I mean, awesome. So again, these are the games that really not only really put Bungie on the map, showcased your incredible technical depth and your design skills, and now you're cross-platform. And so now Bungie takes a bit of a turn, and the next game that you focus on has nothing to do with the first-person shooter genre. You pivot to a game called Myth: The Fallen Lords. So why pivot to a different genre when you're already firing on all cylinders in the FPS genre, right? Was like Warcraft an influence?
Question.
Like, what were you thinking?
Good question. Yeah, no. Well, one of my favorite games was Command and Conquer, and I think I'm trying to remember what the timing of Red Alert was, but we played so much Red Alert at the office, and Warcraft definitely had been around. And there's this really interesting thing that happens when you play those old school RTS games on multiplayer online. Mm-hmm. It's like you invest. So like the loop is kind of built around that single player loop where you invest a lot of time, like gathering resources, building up your base and your equipment, capabilities, army, etc. And then you go and complete in single player, then you go and complete the mission,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a very satisfying feedback loop, even though it's drawn out over time. Whether you succeed or fail, it's all you learn, and then eventually you succeed. In a single player context, it's super satisfying. In a multiplayer context, it can be exceptionally frustrating when you sink an hour into like creating this army, and immediately when the battle begins, you realize you made a mistake in the first 5 minutes that is now going to cause you to lose. And it's kind of a flip the table rage quit moment. It doesn't always happen, but yeah, that's a distinct memory from playing those games multiplayer back in the day. It would happen from time to time. So that in a lot of ways, that was a lot of fuel for an opportunity to do something in a genre that we love that was maybe different, could change the rules a little bit, not focus on necessarily the resource gathering and the base building as much as the deploying your army tactically in a battle. And so that was a lot of the kind of the influential input for how Myth was designed. And the why, I think the why is we had made with Pathways, and 3 marathons plus a couple platforms, a lot of FPS game, and a little bit of pattern fatigue and desire to try to do something different. It did kind of tee up the ability for us. We had always been one team, and that was another conversation, sort of philosophical conversation we had about, can we have a second team? How can we have a second team? Tried it a little bit with Marathon Infinity, and we worked with Greg Kirkpatrick, started a kind of a second team on the outside independently. But by standing up a second franchise with Myth gave us the ability to do that. So when Myth came out and found an audience, we started Myth 2 with a second team. And without that, we probably never would have figured out how to get to Halo.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, it wasn't enough for you just to go ahead and try to correct issues that you saw within a particular genre, right? You always had to add something different to it. A Myth, I remember seeing a review of this or a preview of it in Next Generation magazine in like 97 or something. And it's like, oh, this is going to play out on a 3D playfield, even though there were, the 2D elements there, not fully 3D. But once again, your collective approach to design wasn't just to do what everyone else did. Always found a different flavor, always something else different in there that just made it unique. Right?
That's something, I think, a philosophy that Jason and I shared. And Jason really put that into practice with like the engine, every iteration of that engine added something new. You're exactly right. For Myth, it was the 3D terrain. Yeah. And then when we, the same thing when we got to Halo was, the inside, the outside, on foot, on vehicle.
Yep. And we're gonna
try to stretch, Yeah.
And we're gonna jump to Halo there, but I mean, let's just wrap this piece with, Myth turned out to be a huge commercial success on both PC and Mac. It established Bungie again as a multi-platform developer. It saw the further expansion of Bungie. You had another title with your West Coast a division called Oni, which I loved at the time, and it kind of lives in my same headspace as like Shogo Mobile Armored Division, right, by Jace Hall up at Monolith, right, that same, in that era in which it came out. That was the one game that, as you expanded out of the core location of your organization, that was the one that came in there. And so after Oni kind of winds down and everything, then we move over to Halo. Okay, so Halo, first known as Armor, then Monkey Nuts, then Blam, right?
Well, you did all the research. You got all the code names. Look at you.
It was a fully 3D. It was really designed to be this fully 3D RPG, right? That was the first thought about taking kind of the space kind of setting and environment and the things that you all loved, but it became something different. So how did Halo pivot from this original thought of being this fully 3D RPG into?
Well, I mean, it was a fully 3D kind of RTS, I guess I would say. I mean, it was kind of, the original intention was taking the Myth engine and making it not just terrain 3D, but completely 3D,
Right.
and setting it in a kind of a future military setting. Yeah, there was a series of books. I think they were called Armor that Jason and a team were really into, which was kind of inspiration for some kind of the war theme, the future war theme setting. But yes, it was intended to be RTS with many troops on a battlefield. God view. Initial the camera view was in a high up ISO camera, and then as that team started working together, they started implementing a couple of pivotal things happened. We started implementing real physics into the engine. And I remember Charlie Goff was one of the engineers who designed the Warthog suspension. So you would have these human characters and these Jeeps driving around on a landscape, and the Warthog, the Jeep, I don't think it was quite Warthog then. It was kind of more Jeep, but it had this fully articulated, real physics-driven wheel suspension. So it would be bouncing around the terrain, doing its thing, and you'd look at it, and coders would be like, "Oh, let me move the camera closer," and then you actually see the wheel come, and you're like, "Whoa, that's amazing! That's awesome. How did you do that?" And you'd always want to see that,
right? And
so there was this desire to get the camera closer, and a realization that a war, at that sort of war fight fantasy could be visually a lot more interesting if it was third person. That's kind of where it went first, was third person.
Yeah.
And like I was saying before, that was when it went from, hey, there's all this cool stuff on this terrain, to let's try this as a character, third person character game. That's when it became playable. And we started playing it in the office multiplayer. And just all the different weapons were starting to go in, and we would have a lot of conversation about how the mechanics were feeling, and how it was working, how aim was feeling, and I think Jason was very resistant to put the camera first person because we had done that before, and
right.
We wanted to try something different. But based on those play tests, we tried it, and then never went back.
Yeah, and I loved.
Essentially, the camera started up here, and because we wanted to see stuff, it got closer, and because we wanted to feel stuff more, it just got closer and closer until it was first person and never went back.
And I love the fact that what you're leaning into, right, is not just quantitative data about how we build these things, but it's that gut feeling of, it feels better when I do this. Perhaps we should be moving in, right? And so you're playing with the art, you're playing with the space to kind of chip away all of those extraneous pieces to get to really the fun, and it's something that has been kind of a hallmark of your career and the trajectory Bungie's on. Not to do everything exactly the same. It's not, it's not this derivative thing or carbon copy. It's how do we make these things better, more unique, feel different, right? Put you in a different space than other games that may have kind of skirted in a similar fashion to what you were building. But all right, so Halo was originally planned for the Mac, but then Microsoft had a bunch of these upstart punks in there that wanted to go build a video game console, right? And so mutual friend of ours, Kevin Bacchus, right, and Seamus Blackley were out talking to prospective game devs, and they wanted to bring games to this new console. And Seamus, I remember too, was talking about, we want to build a console for artists, right? It's an artist-first approach. And this unannounced platform called the Xbox. So you and Jason kind of go back to your team at Bungie and said, look, there's an opportunity here for us to be acquired by Microsoft, but we're only going to do this if everybody's in agreement. Like, this is not our decision. We're together kind of as a team to do this. And I assume it was pretty much a unanimous decision of, well, hell yeah, let's go take a risk and go do this thing, right?
Uh, that sounds vaguely reminiscent. I don't know that we absolutely got buy-in from everybody and had those conversations, but it wasn't universal.
Oh, internally?
Yeah, it wasn't universal. Woohoo! Yeah, there was definitely some trepidation on
Yeah.
from a few folks. Some folks who didn't want to leave Chicago because part of the deal was we were going to go get right close to the metal, and build in Seattle. There were definitely some folks who didn't want to leave Chicago. There definitely were some folks that didn't want to go work for Microsoft, which was the complete embodiment of the man, that the culture of the company was very much, we are fiercely independent. And so that was not, it was not an immediate high five, woohoo. There was a lot of introspection and conversation about what we wanted to be and why. But yes, ultimately, the reason that deal happened was because Microsoft and Bungie wanted the same thing, which was to be successful on the biggest stage. And what we saw in Microsoft was a risk, but an opportunity to be a big player on a potentially really big stage.
Yeah.
Which as an independent, and with like the release that we had done right before that, I think Myth 2 was the release that we did right before that, which fantastic game. We had a big recall on it. It was a painful reminder of how difficult it is to operate independently in a maturing market like video games was at the time. So a lot of that was kind of part in our heads about, there's a few paths we can go here. And if you look at the highest upside and the best worst case scenario, they were both really good if we had this partnership. And I mean, we all know how it played out, and there was no assumption that things were going to play out that way. That was the result of a lot of hard work up from a lot of folks.
Yeah.
But that was the thinking when we did that deal. So nobody knew that Xbox would be around. What is it, 30 years later?
Yeah. Yeah. And so when Bungie moved in, you moved under Microsoft Game Studios, which was being helmed again by mutual friend of ours, Ed Fries. Right. And, in conversation with Ed, and we've had him, in to do, fireside chat internally here as well. And he talks about, look, even though we're in this big country, we're the underdog, still in there. So even though, right, you're going to this big corporate space, you still had the kindred spirits, right, of we're building stuff that maybe the company doesn't fully understand, but, by hook or by crook, we got them to invest in this thing and we're going to make a go of it. Right. And I mean, look, it's not hyperbole to say that without Halo, the launch of Xbox would not have been as thunderous as it was. Like, I have plenty of love for, Munch's Odyssey and Cell Damage and Project Gotham Racing, but it was Halo that made you kind of sit up and go, what is happening here? Like, I don't have this experience pretty much on any other platform. And you guys did it. Like, you created this smash success. And I think, wasn't the development time for Halo something like a 9 or 10 month, development period from the time that you went in there, right? To the launch of the Xbox.
It was probably 15 months
15
total.
months overall.
Yeah. And oh man. Yeah. I mean, we got to, honestly, it was amazing that everything came together as it did. It's just a testament to just the talent, and it's more than just talent. It's like responsibility, because a lot of people had to deliver, without being, managed to deliver. They had to stand up and deliver, and they did. Like, we got to E3 before launch. So if you just count the number of months, not many months. That's like May to June, July, August, September, October. We had to be done in October, so 5 months.
Yeah.
And we had one level. 5 months out, we had one level done.
Man, I remember watching this interview with,
And it wasn't even that good. It was running at like 20 FPS, and we were at that E3 and you were like, oh man, I don't know if we should have come to E3. It's like it
yeah.
was a little bit of a meh response.
But you had to be
yeah,
there. I mean,
yeah.
Microsoft set this incredible pace of we're announcing at GDC with the big silver Xbox, like these are all the gates we're going to hit. It's go time, right? And I remember watching an interview with Marty O'Dowd talking about how he didn't have the score ready until literally like a couple of hours. He was getting on a plane and had to go in and burn it to a DVD, and then that's the demo that you all showed off there, right? That iconic opening theme song, right, that puts you in space. Just, absolutely incredible. All right, so moving on, because we have a little bit more of your history to cover before we move to some Q&A here. So you did it. Like, you and Jason led the team on this incredible adventure. You came and you helped establish Xbox as a true player, right, in the console space, and then you leave. Then it was time for you to leave. Like, why? What was next for you? What were you feeling at that time when you made the? You're at the top of the heap here. Why leave?
I want to start a family. I had done. I'd gone nonstop 24/7 for like 12 years. I in the middle of that, I got married and my wife went to vet school, and we were like living in different cities. And by the time we got to the later years with working on Halo and stuff, we were kind of going between Chicago and San Jose, and then it was Chicago, San Jose, Seattle. I would wake up some mornings, I wouldn't even know which city I was in. I'd have to go look out the window, which is a really weird feeling. So yeah, it was an amazing, like when the game came out, was doing well. It was just a fantastic period of time, and I felt like I could take a breath,
Yeah.
And so we came back to Chicago and have had 3 kids, great family, and continued on my journey ever since, and it's been fantastic.
Yeah. And you said, I'm sorry, that your wife was a veterinarian, is that right?
Yeah.
So now, right, once again, you're in a space where you have creative and doctor in the same household, and then raising kids, right?
Yeah, it's interesting though. She is the artist of the family. She definitely has the art gene, and she's not practicing vet medicine anymore, but she is very deep in a lot of different media as an artist.
Awesome. All right, so let's talk about the follow-up, right, to Bungie and going back and starting a family, which takes, tremendous courage to be able to walk away from that and say, this is what I want for my life, and to make so right for me and my family and the things that we want as a family. And nothing but absolute respect for you to make that decision, right? Because it can be tough. And, you've certainly made your series of tough decisions throughout your career. So let's talk about what you're going to tackle next, Wide Load Games. So in 2003, one of the things that you wanted to kind of explore, and I touched on this at the beginning of the interview, was you wanted to change the way game development was done, right? And you saw inefficiencies in the system and the way we had traditionally approached game development. What was different about your approach versus the approach that you had taken at Bungie?
Well, at Bungie, and most developers in that time frame kind of grew organically. Started with a few folks, a core team, and would scale up as projects got bigger. And we've just been on this continual journey as an industry where projects get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And when I was at Microsoft, I watched a lot of teams struggle through their transitions where they would get bigger, bigger, bigger. Project would come out, or maybe worse, project would get canceled. And then, oh my gosh, how do we start something new? We've got 40 people in the room. And that was a very challenging cycle to try to manage through. So, I guess in hindsight, I would say we inadvertently invented the code development process where the intention was to have a consistent team
Hmm.
throughout the building of a game, and to scale and to build production assets and audio and the things that are really important to the creative process of game making, to do that with partners
Yeah.
that could work on other things too, not just for us. And that's how we built Wide Load and operated. So I think we were always 25 folks in the studio, and we're able to build console games, PC games, downloadable games. Had two teams, two projects going at once,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that was the intention behind building the studio that way.
And the two big games that came out of Widely were Stubbs the Zombie and Hail to the Chimp. And then you had a smaller game that was done for a platform called Instant Action. It was a Cyclamite. And one of the things I mentioned to you before we started the conversation, where our paths crossed a little bit. Instant Action, which was a web, as you know, but for our listeners, right, is a web-based platform for game execution. We see a lot of those things like with itch.io and stuff like that today. It was started by Garage Games. And at the time that all of that was happening, IAC was the company, Barry Dilla's company, who acquired Garage Games, turned in Instant Action. I was advising the vice president at IAC about potential acquisitions to start this business, because we had been working with IAC when I was at Sun Microsystems to look at how we create Java games that we could bring to the browser so people could go ahead and play these games without needing to do these downloads, right? And I didn't realize that that was one of the games that you had published was onto that platform, which Lou Castle, who also created Command and Conquer, one of your favorite RTSs, right, was running at that time. All right, so you built all these pieces.
Hey, you left out Guilty Party. That was one of my
That's right, Guilty Party on the
games.
Wii.
That was a Wide Load game. Yeah.
Yeah, that was it. And sorry. So that was no, that's good. That was, you did your research. So that was the last game that you did at Wide Load. And the company was acquired by Disney. Is that correct?
That's right.
Right. Okay. And then you were there doing some work with Disney, and then you pivoted again, and you pivoted to another company you started called Industrial Toys to focus on mobile gaming. And then EA came knocking and acquired Industrial Toys. You had released one game, I think, right? Or no, 3 games as Industrial Toys.
That's right.
And then you were over at EA, and originally then was working on the mobile Battlefield game in prototype. And then that kind of got, shut down. And the company basically shuttered the studio in 23. So now you're out looking for your next things to do. And you lean into this company that you created, Look North World. A company where you're not building your engine, you're not building the audience, you're not building these things. You have a platform which you're able to take what you know from game design and story and development and building those things and distributing these things through UEFN. So how did this come into existence, and why this type of change?
Well, the impetus to just have a look at UEFN was really because, myself and my core team we had left EA at the beginning of the year, and we were looking to stay together and make a game. And when one of my friends at Epic was telling me about the direction Fortnite was going in with UEFN, it just simply sounded like a great platform to build on, because we knew the Unreal Engine, it could be fast, there's a lot of players. We could just, maybe it's another theme, keep control over our work, and what we were going to create and release. And that was my introduction, what made me have a look at it. But the reason we are starting a business, a company, a publisher on this platform is because of the potential for all these community platforms. I think UEFN in particular has a couple things going for it that make it really, really interesting. But this combination of tool set and content and easy deployability and just an amazing, large, engaged community where there's it's kind of the metaverse, for lack of a better word, right? I mean, every character you can imagine is in there, and that nobody's got to leave their friends or their stuff behind to come and play games. So it's just an amazing new kind of platform. And if you think about it, there's a lot of big games that kind of come out of other game communities,
Yeah.
not the least of which are like Counter-Strike or PUBG or
Half-Life,
League.
right?
Yeah, yeah. It's the business is really, we're looking at this as a platform that's very new, that's got a lot of upside to it, not unlike the App Store, when mobile came. And in fact, I think Epic's on track to pay out more money than the App Store did in the first year. So
It's amazing.
just let that sink in and think about like what, the next 3 or 4 years are going to be like, especially in this context where things are getting more expensive to build. It's just getting harder to kind of compete on the high end. There's just lots of really interesting stuff happening on the indie end. And this is the ultimate, platform for being creative and expressing those flexing the indie muscles.
Yeah.
So
I think
it's a very exciting place.
Yeah, and part of that really leans into how do we help developers remove the non-differentiated things out of the way so you can differentiate within a common platform that has a mass audience, that has adoption, right? That has a good and hardened kind of, pathway for distribution. And as we think about those platforms going forward, right, we're going to, and it's not like we have any shortage of these, right? Or I shouldn't say we have any shortage of it. We're starting to see, with that amplification that happens from that when we look at other platforms like what's going on with Roblox and those sorts of things, right? So, yeah, I'm really excited to see I know you guys launched your first island not too long ago, right?
We have 3 islands.
3 islands now. There you go.
Yeah. Outlaw Corral was the first island we released. We released it basically the day we formed the company.
I love that.
So that's how exciting, and fast. We've made 3 games. So if you think about that iterative process of like how you go from learning to getting good to being great, it's that's another reason why it's such a cool platform is you can go through those the whole loop quickly.
Yeah.
And just it's a great learning environment too.
Amazing. Looking forward to seeing what Look North World does next. And so I want to hit on one last thing here, which is your own podcast, which is The Fourth Curtain. And I love what you're doing with the podcast. And one of the reasons I wanted to get an exclusive that you can't get, which is having you on my show, because unless you're going to do, a whole dissection of it by yourself, that would be presumptuous of me to assume that you would do that. But again, I think in all seriousness, I think it's so important that we capture the stories and our history of our industry correctly. And from the people that made that history. So, I'm really thankful that you and Alex Marquin, started your show. We've had some of the same mutual friends on there, right? Cliff Blazinski, Don Daglow, Noah Falstein, Nolan. Yeah, tell me, why did you decide to start this and how's it going? I think you're going into your 2nd season soon, right?
That's right. Thanks for bringing it up, Chris. I think you and I share a similar vibe that way of really wanting to, I started selfishly because I wanted to hear all these stories, and I'm a huge fan of the podcast format, and wanted to be able to share. It's for what we do. It's about the people. It's in the context of games, but the game industry and its history is just very fascinating. The highs and the lows, and the just the creativity and the business aspect and the continual evolution and learning. Getting to know these folks has been a privilege for me, and being able to share their stories on our podcast that's what we're all about. Yes, we are starting our 2nd season. We'll have John Romero on February 1st. So yeah. Y'all should tune into that.
We will be. I'm going to see now what questions you're going to ask him that I didn't ask him when I interviewed him in November.
I'll tell you that the thing that was most interesting to, maybe not most interesting, but the first thing I asked him was if he was using a Mac, because like you said, we grew up same period of time. They were the PC guys, we were the Mac guys, and yes, he is using a Mac.
Yes. He can't. That's part of his DNA.
Blessed
right?
irony.
That's right. Well, Alex, I want to thank you so much for spending time with me today and walking through your incredible history and sharing those stories and why you made the choices you made and really taking a leadership position right within our industry and inspiring other designers and developers to trust their instincts, to build great things, put more art out in the world, find the right people to work together with. Again, the stories of you and the rise of Bungie and the work you've done after, just tremendous. So thank you so much for spending time with us today and sharing your incredible history with us.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for all the very kind words.
Oh,
very, very nice of you.
My pleasure. All right. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.